Avoidant people rarely express love directly because their emotional system is built around self-protection rather than emotional openness. From early experiences, they often learn that showing feelings can lead to disappointment, rejection, or loss of control. So instead of expressing affection in a clear or verbal way, they suppress it or redirect it into safer behaviors. This is why you will rarely hear strong emotional declarations from them, even when their attachment is real. In avoidant psychology, emotional closeness activates internal discomfort. When someone starts to matter deeply, it creates a conflict inside them. One part of them feels connection and attachment, while another part immediately tries to regain independence. This is not because they don't feel love, but because feeling love feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability feels risky to their nervous system. So they replace emotional expression with distance, logic, silence, or even sudden busyness. Instead of saying, "I miss you" or "I care about you," they might show it through indirect actions like checking your updates quietly, staying present without emotional intensity, or returning after pulling away. Their love language becomes subtle, inconsistent, and often confusing for someone expecting direct emotional communication. The deeper the feeling, the more controlled their outward behavior becomes. This creates a misunderstanding. People assume absence of expression means absence of emotion, but in avoidant psychology, emotional depth often increases while expression decreases. They don't lack feelings, they lack comfort in expressing them openly. Emotional closeness feels like loss of control for an avoidant mind, because their sense of safety is strongly tied to independence and self-reliance. When someone gets emotionally closer to them, it is not simply seen as bonding, but as a gradual shift where their personal space, autonomy, and internal stability feel threatened. This doesn't happen consciously all the time. It is more of an automatic psychological response shaped by past emotional experiences where closeness may have felt overwhelming, intrusive, or inconsistent. So when intimacy increases, their nervous system reacts as if something is being taken away, even though logically nothing negative is happening. The more emotionally connected they become, the more they start to feel exposed. And exposure for them is equivalent to vulnerability, and vulnerability is processed as risk. This is why even positive emotional moments can trigger discomfort instead of comfort. As a result, they begin to regulate closeness by creating distance. This can look like delayed responses, emotional withdrawal, changing the topic when things get too deep, or becoming overly focused on personal tasks. It is not a rejection of the other person, but a self-regulation strategy to restore internal balance. The core issue is that emotional closeness removes their feeling of control over how much they are affected by someone else. When they care, they no longer feel fully self-contained, and that dependency, even if mild, creates internal tension. So they unconsciously try to reestablish emotional control by reducing intensity, not because they want to disconnect, but because staying too close feels like losing the emotional boundaries they rely on to feel stable inside. Avoidant individuals often resist intimacy while still developing deeper attachment, which creates an internal contradiction they rarely understand themselves. On the surface, they may appear emotionally distant, controlled, or even uninterested when closeness starts increasing. However, internally, attachment does not stop forming just because they are resisting it. In fact, resistance and attachment often grow at the same time. When emotional connection begins to deepen, their instinct is to pull back to maintain psychological safety. They may reduce communication, avoid emotional conversations, or shift focus to independence and personal space. This creates the impression that they are not invested, but underneath that behavior, emotional bonds are still forming through shared experiences, familiarity, and subtle emotional dependency that builds over time. The key point is that attachment in avoidant psychology is not dependent on expression. They can feel connected without showing it. So while they are actively resisting closeness, their emotional system is still registering the other person as significant. This is why they may become inconsistent. One moment distant, the next moment unexpectedly present. It is not randomness. It is internal conflict between attachment and fear. What makes it deeper is that avoidance does not cancel emotional bonding. It delays its expression. The more they resist, the more pressure builds internally, because feelings that are not expressed do not disappear. Instead, they stay contained, often becoming stronger in silence. So while their behavior suggests detachment, their emotional reality may be the opposite. They are not free from attachment. They are simply trying to manage it without losing their sense of control over themselves. Mixed signals in avoidant psychology are not a sign of confusion in the simple sense, but rather a reflection of internal emotional conflict happening at the same time. When an avoidant person starts developing feelings, their emotional system does not move in a straight line. Instead, it constantly shifts between approach and withdrawal. One part of them feels connection, curiosity, and attachment, while another part immediately activates protection mechanisms that push them to distance themselves. This is why their behavior can seem inconsistent. They might show warmth, attention, or emotional presence at one moment, and then suddenly become distant, unresponsive, or emotionally flat. From the outside, it looks unpredictable, but internally, it is a constant balancing act between two opposing forces. The emotional side pulls them toward closeness, while the protective side pulls them back toward independence. These mixed signals are especially strong when emotional intensity increases. For example, after a meaningful conversation or a moment of vulnerability, they may withdraw shortly after. This is not because the connection disappeared, but because the emotional closeness triggered discomfort. So the withdrawal is not a rejection of feelings, but a reaction to the intensity of those feelings. Another important aspect is that avoidants often try to regulate how visible their emotions are. They may downplay affection, avoid direct emotional expression, or act neutral even when they care deeply. This creates further confusion for the other person because the internal emotional reality does not match the external behavior. So what appears as mixed signals is actually a pattern of emotional push and pull, where attachment is present but constantly managed through distance to maintain psychological stability and a sense of control over vulnerability. Avoidant individuals often downplay what they actually feel because acknowledging strong emotions creates internal discomfort and a sense of vulnerability they are not used to handling. Their emotional system is built around minimizing dependence, so when feelings become intense, their first instinct is not to express them, but to reduce their significance in their own mind. This is a form of self-protection, where they try to make emotions feel smaller, safer, and more manageable than they actually are. When they start developing attachment, instead of openly recognizing it, they may rationalize it. They might tell themselves it is not serious, it is temporary, or it does not require action. This mental reframing helps them avoid the emotional weight that comes with admitting deeper feelings. In many cases, they genuinely feel more than they are willing to accept internally, because acceptance would require emotional exposure and potential loss of control. Downplaying also shows up in their behavior. Even when they care, they may act neutral, avoid emotional language, or reduce expressions of affection. This creates distance between what they feel and what they show. The more intense the emotion becomes, the stronger the tendency to minimize it becomes, because intensity feels overwhelming to their nervous system. This does not mean they are unaware of their emotions. Rather, they selectively reduce their importance to maintain psychological balance. If they fully acknowledge the depth of what they feel, it would challenge their core belief that independence equals safety. So instead of facing that vulnerability directly, they soften it internally, even if it means appearing emotionally detached on the outside while still being deeply affected underneath. Distance in avoidant psychology is not a sign of emotional absence, but a learned coping mechanism used to regulate internal discomfort. When emotional closeness starts to increase, it creates a psychological pressure that feels overwhelming for them, not because the connection is bad, but because it challenges their core need for autonomy and self-control. To manage this internal tension, they instinctively create distance. This distance can appear in many forms, such as replying later than usual, becoming less emotionally expressive, focusing more on personal tasks, or reducing physical and emotional availability. On the surface, it may look like disinterest, but internally it is a strategy to restore emotional balance. By stepping back, they reduce the intensity of feelings they are experiencing, which helps them feel more in control again. For avoidant individuals, emotional closeness often activates fear-based thinking patterns. They may not consciously think, I need to run away, but their nervous system interprets closeness as something that could lead to dependency or emotional overwhelm. Distance becomes the quickest way to reduce that pressure without having to fully confront it. What is important to understand is that distance does not erase attachment. In many cases, feelings continue to exist even while they are physically or emotionally pulling away. The separation gives them space to process emotions in a way that feels safer, even if it creates confusion for the other person. So distance is not equal to disconnection. It is a self-regulation response where stepping back is used to maintain emotional stability, protect inner independence, and prevent feelings from becoming too intense to manage comfortably. When avoidant individuals care about someone, their way of getting closer does not usually follow direct emotional expression. Instead of openly engaging with vulnerability, they prefer to observe from a distance first. This observation phase is a form of emotional processing where they try to understand how safe, stable, and non-threatening the connection feels before fully engaging with it. They are not rushing into closeness, they are analyzing it quietly. This behavior comes from their need to maintain emotional control. Direct involvement feels risky because it exposes them to dependency and unpredictability, so instead of immediately participating in emotional intensity, they stay slightly detached and watch patterns over time. They pay attention to consistency, reactions, and emotional stability in the other person, while also monitoring their own internal responses. Even though they may not express interest openly, their awareness of the person becomes stronger. They notice small details, changes in behavior, and emotional shifts more than they would admit. This silent attention is actually a sign of engagement, even if it does not look like traditional closeness. Observation also helps them regulate their own feelings. By staying in a watching position, they can experience attachment without feeling fully exposed. It creates a psychological buffer between emotion and action, allowing them to feel connected while still protecting their independence. So instead of moving closer in a direct or expressive way, they first build familiarity through distance. This controlled observation becomes their entry point into attachment, where connection grows quietly before it is ever acknowledged or shown outwardly in a clear emotional form. For avoidant individuals, small actions carry far more emotional weight than big, dramatic expressions of love. This is because they are generally uncomfortable with overt emotional intensity, so they rarely rely on direct verbal affection or grand romantic gestures. Instead, their feelings are revealed through subtle, almost invisible behaviors that require careful attention to notice. These small actions can include things like consistently remembering minor details about someone, checking in indirectly without making it emotional, staying present in practical ways, or quietly maintaining contact even when they appear distant. On the surface, these behaviors may look ordinary or even insignificant, but in avoidant psychology, they are actually meaningful indicators of emotional investment. The reason small actions matter more is because they bypass their emotional defense system. Large expressions of love feel overwhelming and expose vulnerability, so avoidants often avoid them. But small, controlled actions allow them to stay connected without triggering emotional discomfort. This creates a situation where their care is expressed in fragments rather than declarations. Another important aspect is consistency. If an avoidant person continues small forms of engagement over time, it shows that the emotional connection is stable enough to persist despite their natural tendency to withdraw. Even brief moments of effort, like responding after distance or returning after silence, can carry significant meaning in this context. So while others may look for words or obvious affection, understanding avoidant psychology requires noticing the quiet patterns. Their emotional reality is often hidden in actions that seem minor, but actually reveal ongoing attachment beneath their controlled and restrained external behavior. In avoidant psychology, acting indifferent right when emotions are strongest is not a contradiction, but a protective reaction triggered by emotional overload. When feelings become intense, the avoidant mind experiences internal discomfort because emotional intensity feels like loss of control. Instead of leaning into that emotion, their system automatically shifts into emotional suppression to reduce the pressure they are feeling inside. At the exact moments when attachment is strongest, their awareness of vulnerability also becomes strongest. This creates an internal alarm response where closeness feels overwhelming, even if the emotion itself is positive. To manage this, they often switch into a detached or neutral state externally. This can look like cold behavior, lack of interest, or emotional flatness, even though internally they may be highly affected. This indifference is not a true reflection of emotional absence, but a regulation strategy. By acting like they are unaffected, they create psychological distance between themselves and the intensity of their feelings. It gives them a sense of stability, as if they are regaining control over emotions that feel too strong to handle openly. Another layer to this behavior is self-protection from dependency. When emotions peak, avoidants become more aware that they might start relying on someone emotionally. Instead of allowing that dependency to grow, they unconsciously reduce emotional expression to prevent deeper attachment from forming too quickly. So the indifference seen from the outside is often a mask over heightened internal emotional activity. The stronger the feelings, the more controlled and detached their behavior may appear, because emotional intensity for them is not expressed outwardly, but managed internally through withdrawal and restraint. The withdrawal phase in avoidant psychology often appears exactly when attachment is starting to form, which creates confusion because it happens at the moment when connection feels like it is becoming real. Instead of moving closer as emotional bonding increases, avoidant individuals instinctively pull back to regulate the intensity of what they are experiencing internally. This is not a conscious decision to end connection, but a nervous system response to emotional overload. As feelings deepen, their internal balance starts to shift. Emotional closeness activates both attraction and discomfort at the same time. The attraction pulls them toward engagement, while the discomfort signals potential loss of independence. When this conflict becomes strong enough, withdrawal becomes the fastest way to reduce internal tension. It allows them to regain a sense of emotional control without having to directly confront the vulnerability they are feeling. During this phase, behavior changes can become noticeable. Communication may decrease, responses may become delayed, and emotional openness may reduce significantly. To an outside observer, it can seem like disinterest or fading connection. However, internally, attachment is often still developing or already present. The withdrawal is not the disappearance of feelings, but a way of managing them. What makes this phase complex is that it often strengthens attachment rather than eliminating it. Emotional distance can increase mental focus on the connection because unresolved feelings remain active beneath the surface. The avoidant person is not necessarily letting go. They are stepping back to process emotions in isolation where they feel safer, even if it creates uncertainty in the relationship dynamic. When an avoidant individual starts checking on someone indirectly, it is one of the clearest signs that emotional attachment is already present, even if they do not openly acknowledge it. Indirect checking means they are staying updated about the person without direct engagement, such as viewing updates, asking about them through others, or quietly monitoring their presence in subtle ways. This behavior allows them to stay emotionally connected while still maintaining a sense of distance and control. The reason this happens is because avoidant individuals struggle with direct emotional involvement, but they cannot completely disconnect once attachment begins forming. So instead of expressing interest openly, they create a safer method of staying emotionally informed. This helps them manage their curiosity and emotional pull without feeling exposed or vulnerable. Indirect checking is also a way of regulating emotional uncertainty. When someone matters to them, complete disconnection feels uncomfortable, but direct communication feels too intense, so they settle into a middle space where they can observe without engaging. This gives them emotional reassurance while still protecting their independence. What makes this behavior significant is that it requires effort and attention. If there was no emotional involvement, there would be no reason to stay updated at all. Even small, repeated acts of checking indicate that the person occupies mental space consistently. It shows that attachment is active beneath their controlled exterior. So while they may appear detached on the surface, Indirect checking reveals ongoing emotional investment. It is a quiet form of connection where interest exists without expression and attachment continues without direct interaction, showing that their feelings are present even when their behavior seems restrained. The most powerful sign in avoidant psychology is emotional presence despite physical or behavioral distance, because it reveals that attachment is still active even when expression is minimized. Avoidant individuals often create space between themselves and others when emotions become intense, but if the emotional connection is real, that distance does not fully remove their internal engagement. Instead, they remain mentally and emotionally aware of the person while still keeping outward separation. This emotional presence is subtle and not always visible through direct actions. They may not communicate often, or they may appear detached in behavior, but they continue to think about the person, react internally to reminders, and maintain a form of psychological connection. The key difference is that their attachment exists internally rather than externally expressed. What makes this so significant is that avoidant individuals are naturally inclined to disconnect when overwhelmed, so if they remain emotionally present in any capacity, it indicates that the bond has already taken deeper root. Even in silence or distance, the emotional connection does not fully fade. It continues in the background of their thoughts and awareness. This presence often shows through delayed returns, re-engagement after withdrawal, or subtle emotional responsiveness after periods of distance. They may come back into interaction without explaining their absence, but the underlying connection remains intact. So emotional presence without physical closeness becomes the strongest indicator that attachment is real. It shows that even though they are managing feelings through distance, they have not fully detached internally, and the emotional link continues to exist beneath their controlled outward behavior.